Okay guys, Timmy coming at you here. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you the differences between hyper and hypothyroidism and what causes it. What you need to do is you need to make sure that you watch the video on the functions of thyroid hormone so that you understand the basic physiologic functions that thyroid hormone produces. And remember that thyroid hormone comes in two forms, comes in T3 and T4. T3 being the most physiologically active form of thyroid hormone. You should also understand the function of TSH and the release of TSH and how that works as a negative feedback mechanism, so that when you understand labs or get labs, you'll be able to understand why TSH is high or low in hypo or hyperthyroidism. That's very important. So let me begin first. We talked about the thyroid gland and its location and how TSH released from the anterior pituitary will stimulate the thyroid gland to begin the production of thyroid hormone. One important thing to remember too is the only organ of the body that requires iodine is the thyroid gland, and that's important when you talk about hyperthyroidism and a way to destroy the thyroid gland. If you understand that the only cell that uses iodine is the thyroid gland, then physicians, real smart people with the tape and pocket protectors, figured out that you can destroy the thyroid gland by attaching a radioactive isotope to iodine. And iodine will get taken up by the thyroid gland, and the result is destruction of the thyroid gland and hyperthyroidism. So again, as I always do, I'm going to use two curved lines in a circle to help us explain how this works. So let me go over first hypothyroidism. The most common form of hypothyroidism, right? Hypothyroid. Is Hashimoto's disease. And again, I'd like you to think about it. What are the odds of someone getting a disease that was named after them, like Hashimoto actually getting Hashimoto's disease? That's a smiley face. Okay, so hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's disease, the most common form, is referred to as autoimmune. So basically what that means is that the immune system did not get the message that your thyroid is good for you. You need your thyroid gland. So what happens is B cells and T cells, specifically B cells, will begin to produce antibodies. And these antibodies will begin to destroy the thyroid gland. Now, if you understand that, then it's going to make perfect sense. So the antibody can be measured. And in people with Hashimoto's disease, that antibody is very high. And that antibody is called the thyroid peroxidase antibody. And basically what happens is that antibody attacks and destroys TSH receptors. Now if you remember, right, you got your thyroid gland cell here, we'll call it a thyroid gland cell, and in order for the thyroid gland cell to begin the production of thyroid hormone, it has to bind thyroid stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary, has to bind to a thyroid stimulating hormone. You're not going to believe this. Receptor. And when that happens, you begin the production of thyroid hormone, T4, in the thyroid gland. Now watch that video. So in people with Hashimoto's disease, they build up a TSH receptor antibody. And again, this is one time that the body does stuff that doesn't make sense. And that antibody destroys TSH receptors, and then it will begin the destruction of thyroid gland cells. So how do you get T4 to be produced? Well, TSH has to bind to a receptor. If those receptors are destroyed by this antibody, then the result is that you can't make T4. And if you can't make T4, you can't make T3. So these people develop hypothyroidism. So the only thing that they can do then is they can take T4. T4 is called levothyroxine. And that's what they take. So how do they treat the hypothyroidism? TSH can't stimulate the receptors because the antibodies destroyed it. So you can't make T4. So what do? You give them T4 in a pill. That gets into the blood, and then T4 goes to the liver and is converted to T3. So that's the treatment. A couple of things about Hashimoto's disease. Number one, it's 7 times more prevalent in women than men. So hypothyroidism much more common in women than men. The other thing is that in the early stages of the disease, now this is important, Hashimoto's disease can actually mimic, well not mimic, it will actually produce symptoms of hyperthyroidism. And the reason for that is, remember that you got T4 sitting in a thyroid gland cell. So when these TSH antibodies destroy the receptor, it can also destroy the cell and result in a dumping of T4 into the blood. The result is that T4 will circulate to the liver and be converted to T3. So in the early stages of Hashimoto's, the person may present with signs and symptoms of hyperthyroidism. And how you diagnose that is by measuring that thyroid peroxidase antibody. And that can give you an idea as to whether or not it is truly hyperthyroidism or if it's hypothyroidism. Now, again, if you know the functions of the hormone, then you know what's going to happen to the person. So first of all, one of the functions of thyroid hormone is to control your basal metabolic rate, right? Basal metabolic rate is how many calories you burn at rest. And there's 2 big determinants of that. Number one is physical activity, right? More physically active, you burn more calories. But there are just some people who at rest naturally burn more calories, and that comes down to understanding, again, stuff that happens at the level of the cell. Now, if you remember, you've got these little ion leak channels in all your cells, and we learned that sodium's highly concentrated in the blood, potassium's highly concentrated in the cell. Sodium will leak through a sodium channel, potassium will leak through a potassium channel and follow their concentration gradient. But to maintain the concentration of sodium and potassium in the blood and sodium in the blood and potassium in the cell, then you got to have our buddy, our pal, the sodium potassium pump. And the job of the sodium potassium pump, as you recall, is to pump 3 sodiums that leaked in, pump them out into the blood, and then 2 potassiums that leaked out and pump them back into the cell. And because you're working against the concentration gradient, that requires ATP, right? That's the energy that the cell uses. Now, you also remember that when you have ATP, and to use it, you got to hack off that 3rd phosphate, and that's going to release some energy, but it's also going to release some heat. All right? Now, if a person is hypothyroid, then the cells become less leaky to sodium and potassium. So what that means is if they become less leaky, the pump doesn't have to work as much. So you won't be using as much ATP at rest than you normally will. And the result is that there will be a drop in your basal metabolic rate. And if you recall, one of the byproducts of using ATP is energy to make the pump work, and then some heat. So these people will have a drop in core body temperature. So one of the symptoms of hypothyroidism is they're always complaining that they are cold, right? Their hands and feet will get cold. And again, the body does stuff that makes sense, right? You got to keep your core body temperature at 98.6. So if you can't do it because you're not generating enough heat through less use of the sodium potassium pump, then the body is going to vasoconstrict all the arteries that supply the non-essential parts of your body to send that nice warm blood to keep the core body temperature up. So they're going to be cold. They'll have cold hands and feet, and maybe a cold nose too, kind of like a little dog. Rough, rough. Okay. Now, because of the drop in core body basal metabolic rate. Now look, where do you get the energy to make the ATP to make your pump work? You eat food. So if the pump ain't pumping because the cells are less leaky to sodium and potassium, anything that you eat, I don't care what it is, carbs, fats, or protein, in excess, that's not being used to make ATP, will ultimately get stored as fat. So if you're not using the stuff that you ate to make the pump work, then it will get converted to fat. So these people will begin to gain weight. And a real simple rule of thumb is to think that thyroid hormone speeds everything up. So if you don't have thyroid hormone, everything begins to slow down. And the non-essential parts are going to be, they're going to be kind of attacked first, meaning the body's going to do stuff that makes sense. The most critical, essential parts of the body that need to keep functioning are going to function first, and the body will begin to slowly turn off the non-essential parts due to the drop in thyroid hormone. So they're going to be cold. They're going to gain weight. The other thing that you learned by watching the video is that thyroid hormone, both T3 and T4, especially T3, what it does is it makes the cells more sensitive to epinephrine. So epinephrine is going to increase your heart rate and increase your blood pressure. So if you have low thyroid hormone, as seen in Hashimoto's, then the effects of epinephrine are going to be blunted. So epinephrine will have less of effect so that will drop their heart rate, and that will drop their blood pressure. Now, one of the other functions of thyroid hormone is to, in the early stages, is to increase central nervous system development. That's why babies born hypothyroidism develop cretinism. They're short in stature, their head is smaller, and they're usually mentally retarded or have severe developmental delays. So if you develop it later in life, then what's going to happen is mental activity is going to decrease. So that could explain a lot of student behavior. You know, maybe some of them are hypothyroid. Okay, wait. I'm just kidding, so I'm going to put a little smiley face there. Right? So with decreased mental activity, these people are always going to be tired. I'm so tired. They want to sleep all the time. Right? Even when they do sleep, they never feel like they got enough rest. Mentally, they are sluggish, right? They just aren't on top of things. They gain weight, their heart rate and blood pressure are going to be low. In women, right, the menstrual cycle becomes irregular. Again, watch, you can live without having a period, right? So the body is going to do stuff that makes sense. So it costs energy to have a period and do all that stuff. So your periods will become irregular. In some cases, you won't get a period at all. In men, it can lead to erectile dysfunction. So again, always think of those terms. The other thing that they're going to develop is constipation. Now, again, thyroid hormone tends to speed everything up, regardless of what it is. So if you are hypothyroid, that's going to slow everything down. That's going to slow GI activity down. And the result will be constipation. Right? Isn't that lovely? The other thing is that thyroid hormone does is that it controls cell division. Right? And increases protein synthesis, literally in almost all cells. So if cells divide less, slower than they normally did, hair is skin cells, right? So your skin, the basal layer of your epidermis, continues to divide. But if you're hypothyroid, that's going to decrease cell division. So the hair will fall out, but it won't get replaced. So your hair will begin to thin. And that's usually one of the things that the doctor will ask. So when you think of hypothyroidism, it's going to slow everything down. The other thing, if you remember, is that thyroid hormone makes cells more sensitive to epinephrine. So if there is a drop in thyroid hormone, there will be a corresponding drop in the sensitivity of cells to epinephrine. So the drop in epinephrine will lead to a drop in heart rate and blood pressure. So these people may develop hypotension, right, or severe bradycardia where it's systematic. And then the mental function, right? Again, thyroid hormone tends to speed things up. Lack of thyroid hormone is going to slow mental functions down. So how do you diagnose that? Well, it's based on history, physical exam, right? Person's going to be complaining of tired, I'm gaining weight, puffy. So the doctor will take that into account and look at the history. So you're more likely to develop hypothyroidism if you have a history of hypothyroidism in your family. The lab test that you're going to do, at least initially, is you're going to do a TSH. Then you're going to look at T4, the free, right, not bound to albumin, T4 and T3. Because remember, just like calcium, the only physiologic calcium is the one that's floating freely in the blood, the ionized stuff. So the only physiologic thyroid hormone is the one that is free. So you'll measure free T3 and T4 levels. So when you look at this, remember that thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says it does. It's a hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland to begin the production of T4. So it's like telling your kid to clean the room. So TSH is you and T4 is your kid, right? So if you tell your kid to clean its room, so if TSH tells the thyroid gland to produce T4 and it does it, then you don't have to release any more thyroid hormone. You don't have to tell the kid again. They did it. So in hypothyroidism, you will have low T4, low T3, and you will have an elevated TSH. So again, the analogy for hypothyroidism, if you are the parent, TSH, and your kid is T4, and you tell them to clean their room, and they don't do it, you have to keep telling them. So people get confused as to why the TSH would be elevated in hypothyroidism. All TSH is doing is telling the thyroid gland to produce the metabolically active T4, and then the liver produces T3. Now, when we come back to T3, where's T3 produced? It's produced in the liver. And I told you this, and I told you never forget this, ever. When an organ fails, all the functions of that organ fail. And one of the functions of the liver is to convert T4 to the more powerfully acting T3, triiodothyronine. And I'm sure I told you this, but I'll tell you again. I'm willing to give any student extra credit if they're willing to legally change their name to triiodothyronine. So if you're willing, let me know about it in class. So if the liver fails, then T4 will be produced by the thyroid gland, but the liver will not be able to produce T3, which is the most metabolically active form of thyroid hormone. That's why people with liver disease can develop hypothyroidism. Do you see that? So again, watch. If you know the functions of thyroid hormone, then you're going to know what happens if you don't have enough. And you need to understand how your basal metabolic rate is controlled. And one of the biggest ways is by controlling how leaky your cells are to sodium and potassium, and that ultimately determines how much the pump has to run. So that's a little talk, very little, on the effects of hypothyroidism and specifically Hashimoto's disease. Hope you learned something.